Okay, so this is part 3 of Introduction to the Talmud, especially designed for women. Just let me straighten this out. There we go. And we are ready to roll. Okay, last week what we left off with, we looked at some of the history of the Tzurat Hadaf, of the actual structure of a page of Gemara. We looked at the actual large text in the inside. We looked at a sample of a page where we saw Rashi on the inside of the page, Tosfot on the outside of the page, and we explained what the function of Rashi and Tosfos are. We explained what the word Shas means. Does anyone remember what the word Shas means? Shisha Sidarim, it's an acronym. Shisha Sidarim or Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. And it stands for the 6 orders of the Mishnah, and we went over what each Maseches is all about. The only one that I didn't explain exactly correctly is Masechet Yadayim, which is at the very end. It's all about the tumah of the hands. That's what I meant to say. Okay, so now let's take a look at hermeneutic methodology. That's fancy words, which you'll never hear in a Beit Midrash, because really, the term that we use is drasha, to make a drasha. Now, when you hear, you go, oh, did you hear the rabbi's drasha? It was terrible, right? So the word drasha, which we use in the vernacular, refers to a sermon. But that's not what the word drasha means in Talmudic parlance. What it means is the method by which the rabbis derive law from the text of the Chumash. Okay, that's what a drasha is. A drasha is a hermeneutic derivation. It's a method of deriving law from the biblical text. Okay? Now, this is a primary function of the Talmud. A primary function of the Talmud is to explain to us how rabbinic law, or law as we have it today, or what we would call Torah Sheba'al Peh, was drawn from the Chumash itself. Now, it's important to distinguish. Much of rabbinic law has no origin in the Torah whatsoever. That's what we call midrabanan, rabbinic enactments, such as Hanukkah is a rabbinic enactment. You won't find any legitimate basis for it in the Chumash, because it's not a biblical holiday. It was never designed in the Torah itself to be part of religious Jewish practice, although there may be some allusions on a prophetic level to Hanukkah. But there's no real solid derivation that we can say, well, based on this pasuk, we know that there's a law of Hanukkah. That doesn't exist, because Hanukkah was invented in the post-biblical period because of historical events that happened in a post-biblical period, during the Second Temple period. So, there's rabbinic law, but there's also Torah Sheba'al Peh law that is not explicit in the text of the Bible, in the text of the Torah, but which is derived through a drasha by the rabbis. Now this is where it requires a lot of emunah chachamim, faith in the sages. Because essentially what the sages are telling us is that when we receive the Torah, we received also certain hermeneutic tools that allow us to know what the pasuk really means, even though the face value of the pasuk is not saying that. But because of the structure of the text, because of the occurrence of words and the way that they're positioned, because of a number of different circumstances, we are able to derive law. Now, most of the time, the law had been passed down to the sages from generation to generation, and its derivation from the biblical text was also passed down from generation to generation. There were other times when the law was passed down, but the derivation or that which linked it to the biblical text was forgotten or lost in the sands of time. And therefore you will find sometimes that the sages will try to do reverse engineering, to go back and say, we know that there's such a law based on our oral tradition, but where is it alluded to in the Bible? Where is it alluded to in the Chumash? And the reason for that is because the rabbis have a basic tradition that when it comes to almost all law that was passed down to us at Mount Sinai, there must be some reference to that law in the Chumash itself. There are rare exceptions. There are rare exceptions where the rabbis will say that this is not something that can be connected to a pasuk, but it is rather what we call halacha lemoshe misinai. Whenever you see that term used in the Talmud, what it means is that there is no reference in the biblical text itself for this law, but it is part of a tradition that was passed down to us from Sinai. And usually, not always, but usually it refers to a detail about a law. So for example, tefillin. We know that tefillin are supposed to be cubic, and they're supposed to be made out of leather, and it's supposed to be black in color, and there are 4 chambers in the tefillin. Some of the details of the laws of tefillin are not rooted in the biblical text. Some of it is. So for example, the word totafot, according to the sages, which is the way that the Torah refers to tefillin, makes reference to a 4-chambered object. But that the tefillin should be black, and that the straps should be black, and that it should be made out of leather, much of that is halacha l'Moshe misinai. So some of the details are not always rooted in biblical text. So, but the fact that we sometimes have the tradition of what the law is and its biblical connection, sometimes the Gemara will present to you the law, and it will present to you, this is where it's rooted in the psukim. This is how it's connected or derived in the psukim. Sometimes the rabbis will debate about where it's derived in the psukim, because they know of the law, but over the sands of time it was forgotten which pasuk alludes to that, and therefore you'll find that they dispute that. Okay? One of the things that the rabbis say is that a sage, even from the times of the Mishnah, and certainly post-Mishnah, which is from the times of the Gemara, does not have the authority to hermeneutically derive a new law from the text. In other words, you can't just say, well, this is my interpretation of the text, and based on my interpretation of the text and my application of well-known hermeneutic principles, I would like to pronounce this new law that no one's ever heard of before, law X. That you cannot do. So, therefore, there must be a tradition of an oral tradition of such a law existing, right? Let's say, for example, when the Torah prohibits basar b'chalav, when it prohibits milk and meat, the rabbis tell us we have a tradition that not only are milk and meat prohibited for eating, but you're not even allowed to get benefit other than eating from milk and meat, which means you can't sell a milk and meat product to a non-Jew, even though for that person it's kosher. But if you're benefiting from its sale, that's prohibited. And you're also not allowed to cook milk and meat together, even if you're not getting any benefit from it, just the act of cooking is prohibited. That's a tradition. And that was passed down to us. The rabbis say, where do we know it? Oh, because it says the pasuk lo tivashel gedi b'chalei v'imo 3 times. But a rabbi is not going to come up and say, our tradition was up until today that you're just not allowed to eat milk and meat, but I believe that the Torah is communicating an additional law. A rabbi is not going to say that. He doesn't have the authority to innovate a law that's extracted from the Bible. Now, remember, rabbis innovate law all the time, but it's clearly delineated that it's not a law that is rooted in the biblical text, but rather it is of rabbinic status. So this is important to know. It's a little bit complex, I grant you, but it is important to know that there is a divide between law that is rooted in the Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, that is midioraita, that is from the Torah, and Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is midirabanan, which is from the rabbis. What are some important applications of this? Well, there are differences between rabbinic law and biblical law, even though they're both part of an oral tradition. For example, there are many times when one can be lenient if one knows that the law is rabbinic. Let's say in cases of where you're not sure whether there's something is prohibited or not. So we say, safek derabanan lekula. When there's a doubt of whether there's a rabbinic prohibition, you may be lenient. Safek deoraita lechumra. When there's a doubt about a biblical prohibition, you must be machmir, you must be stringent. So therefore, it's always very important to know when a law is rabbinic in nature or biblical in nature, and that's part of the study on each page of the Talmud. Sometimes the Gemara isn't clear until it has to clarify, is this a rabbinic law or is this a biblical law? There's even a few places in the Talmud where the Talmud would say, this appears to be a biblical law because our tradition is, according to Rabbi so-and-so, that it is rooted in the pasuk. And then the Gemara corrects itself and it says, no, we were wrong. It's really a rabbinic law, and he was just using that pasuk as a mnemonic device to help him remember the rabbinic law and to reinforce the law. But it's actually not rooted hermeneutically in that pasuk. So that happens quite often as well. So when I say hermeneutic principles, it's actually in the Siddur. There are classically 13 hermeneutic keys which the rabbis use to derive law. And this is only one version. There's another version that says there are 26 keys. And I think there's even another version that says there are 48, but I don't remember. The point is that this is the standard list, but there's even a disagreement in what all of the hermeneutic keys are. This is the majority accepted list of hermeneutic principles. And the reason why I say it's a majority accepted is because virtually everything that I tell you, the answer is machloket. It's a dispute, right? If you're never sure about what the law should be, if you just say it's a machloket, then you'll sound very wise. So that's usually what I tell people. You know, Rabbi, is it kosher or not? Oh, it's a machloket. Oh, the rabbi knows so much. Okay, anyway. The point being is that even the hermeneutic principles are the subject of a machloket. What they are and how to apply them. You have different academies that are going on at the same time during the Talmudic period. And the different academies sometimes don't always agree on the methodology of derivation. But eventually what emerges by the majority are these 13. Yes?
Quick question. What is an example of the rabbinical law that you can be lenient on? And I asked this lady and she said perhaps fasting or not on Tisha B'Av.
No, not Tisha B'Av.
Oh, not such a strict holiday. Like,
Well, Tisha B'Av is a rabbinic holiday. It's a rabbinic fast day, so there are reasons to be more lenient on rabbinic fast days versus on Yom Kippur.
Yeah.
Which is a biblical fast day. So that's one example.
Any others?
If a person is not sure whether a non-kosher substance fell into a pot, if it's only rabbinically non-kosher, you can be lenient. If it's biblically non-kosher, you'd have to be stringent.
So what's that? Like, let's boil, with the milk falling into the boiling soup pot, you know you can still have the soup and you're okay.
Right. So there may be situations where something midioraita is batel, is nullified, where midorabban, rabbinically the rabbis say it's not batel, and you're not sure whether it even is in the substance, so then you can be lenient. These, of course, are fine-tuned points, which require, like, you have to take it case by case. Yes?
When you
developed these principles? Like, when was this?
Well, this list is listed by Rabbi Yishmael. He's the author of these 13, but they were in wide use during his time. He's just there to classify what they are for us. So like I said, if we receive the tradition at Har Sinai, then we received these tools at Har Sinai as well. These keys were passed down at Har Sinai as well. The debate is, did we exactly explain the tool correctly and how widely is the tool used? Sometimes that's the subject of debate. We're not going to go through all 13 carefully because it's going to become too complicated. But I want to just go through a couple of them so that you'll see. Some of them are based on exercises in logic, and some of them are based on a certain kind of hermeneutics that is unique to Talmudic law. So the first one is called the Kal Vachomer, which is a universal logical principle. It makes sense that if something which is not strict has a din, then a stricter case will definitely have that din. It's just a logical argument. What is it called? A fortiori? Is that what it's called? I don't remember the technical term. For example, if it is usher to pluck an apple from a tree on Yom Tov, when it is mutter to cook, litzorech ochel nefesh, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov for food, then surely plucking it on Shabbos, which is much stricter than Yom Tov, is asur. So therefore, that's an example of a kal v'chomer. Like my Rebbe always used to say, if a person can lift 200 pounds, can bench press 200 pounds, then surely they can bench press 100 pounds. So it's the same principle. It's using logic to say that if the law applies over here, then certainly the law applies over here. That's number one. But that's the easy example. Let's go on to some other examples. Number two, Gezerah Shava. When two cases or two psukim have the same word in the Torah, then we learn the din of one case to the other case. For example, the word b'mo'ado, in its time, is written in reference to the Korban Tamid, to the daily Tamid sacrifice. And by the Korban Pesach, it's also written. It's also, obviously, the person who did these sheets, to whom I'm very grateful, speaks a yeshivish English. Yes. How do you know he speaks yeshivish English? Because it says the word was written by the Korban Tamid, right? So it's written in reference to the Korban Tamid. The word b'mo'ado appears in the Torah. The word b'mo'ado appears in the Torah in the context of the Korban Pesach as well. So we learn out, right? That's also a yeshivish term. Okay, so we learn out that the Korban this is very helpful because now when you hear two yeshiva bachrim speak, you know what language they're speaking. Okay, so we learn out that the Korban Tamid is brought every day, including the Sabbath. And how do we derive that? Because since we know that the Paschal offering is brought even on the Sabbath, we therefore derive that the Tamid sacrifice is brought even on the Sabbath. We therefore say the same. In other words, we know that the Korban Tamid is brought every day, and we therefore say the same that the Korban Pesach is also brought even when it's a Saturday. So what we do is we apply Gezerah Shava. Once we know the law is true in case A, and we know that Pasuk A has the same word as Pasuk B, then we apply all of the laws of Pasuk A to the laws that are contained within Pasuk B. Now clearly, this could go on ad infinitum. What about the word et or vayidaber, right? Very ubiquitous words that appear in the Torah. So that's why the rabbis are very clear to say, Ein Adam Dan Gezerah Shava Me'atzmo. You can't make up a Gezerah Shava and say, oh, I found this word over here and this word over here, ergo, they share the same law. Again, all of this is based on a tradition that we know what the law is. The rabbis knew that the Korban Pesach is brought on Shabbat. The question is, where does it come from? So the Talmud says, it's based on a Gezerah Shava that was passed down to us also at the same time that the law was passed down. Moshe Rabbeinu explained to us that these words are shared to teach us that the law of the Korban Tamid and the law of the Korban Pesach have this feature that makes them have this common link. A corollary of that is something called a hekesh, that when two topics or cases are placed adjacent to each other in the Torah, then many dinim are learned out one from the other. So, for example, the laws of marriage and divorce are listed adjacent to each other in the Torah, and therefore the rabbis tell us that they share common laws. That's a corollary of a Gzeira Shava. Number 3, Binyan Av. What is a Binyan Av? It's where you have, I'll read it, a rule which is learned from one pasuk can be used to teach us the same din to a logical similar case. And what that means is that if the Torah tells you you have mitzvah A, and there are certain features of mitzvah A, so those features will apply to all other mitzvot that are logically similar to mitzvah A. So, for example, the Torah forbids one from marrying one's father's sister. So using this binyan av or mematzinu principle teaches us that it is also usher to marry a mother's sister. Because what the rabbis basically do is they extend it using the principle of binyan av, that if logically the Torah doesn't want me to marry my parent's sibling, I can't only not marry my father's sister, but I also cannot marry my mother's sister.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
This reminds me of the situation where, the people forgot that you cannot marry I'm thinking of the Purim story. You can't marry a Moavi, but you can marry a Moaviyah. You would think you can't marry a Moavi, you also
Moabite,
can marry
right.
a Moaviyah. So that's
Yeah.
an exception, where just because you think it's the same relationship, right?
That's a fascinating case that you bring up because the Gemara actually discusses the history of that law. That was an example of something which historically had been forgotten by a great segment of the rabbinic community. So the Gemara relates that in the times of King David, there were people who questioned whether King David was a legitimate Jew, because they knew that he was descended from Ruth the Moabite. And the assumption was that when the Torah says that a Moabite may not enter into the congregation of God, it means anyone who is a descendant of any kind of Moabite. Until one of the rabbis in King David's time came along and he said, I have a tradition going all the way back that the Torah only meant a Moabite man and not a Moabite woman. So that's again an example, it's a historical example of where sometimes, even in the rabbinic community, a tradition may have been forgotten by a large segment of the community until someone says, I have it on good authority because I heard it from my teacher, heard it from his teacher, going all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Very good. Okay, let's go on to number 4. Klal uprat. Now we get a little bit more technical and more specific to the hermeneutics of the Bible and of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Torah sometimes generalizes and then is specific. We learn only the specific details and not the general information. The prat, the specific, is the way the Torah explains the general term, the klal, which means that if in the phraseology of the law the Torah makes a general statement and then makes a specific statement, the specific statement is there to limit the scope of the general statement, and it's coming to tell you that only in the specific case does the law apply, not in the more general, in the general phrase. For example, by the Parsha of Karbanos, when the Torah talks about bringing sacrifices, it says, min ha-behema, any animal. Now that's a general statement. It's very generic. You can bring an aardvark according to that. And then a few psukim later it says, min ha-bakar u'min ha-tzon, only from cattle and sheep. Min ha-behema is a klal which includes all animals. Min ha-bakar u'min ha-tzon is a prat which explains what the klal means. Namely, what type of animal? Only bakar and tzon. The Torah will then have sometimes something called a pratu klal, where the exact opposite takes place in the phraseology of the psukim. where first the specific is mentioned and then a general statement. If the Torah is first specific and then after it generalizes, then the klal adds to the prat, and we learn more than just the prat. So, for example, in the parsha of Hashavat Aveda, the law of returning lost items, it first says, V'chein ta'aseh lachamoro, v'chein ta'aseh l'simlato. That so shall you do, meaning return a person's lost donkey or a person's lost garment. And then the Torah says, V'chein ta'aseh l'chol avedat achicha. The more general phrase comes afterwards where the Torah says, so shall you do for anything that is lost by your brother. The klal at the end of the pasuk teaches us that one is mechuyav, one is obligated to do the mitzvah of hashavat aveda for any lost object. The word chamoro and simlato, which are the prat, teach us to exclude specific things that one is not obligated to fulfill the mitzvah of hashavat aveda for. So only specific things are excluded. A small list are excluded, but the general idea is you should return all lost objects. So, number 4 is klal uprat, number 5 is prat uklal, and now we go to klal uprat uklal, which is an even more special case where the Torah's phraseology in the pasuk is general statement, specific clause, followed by a general clause. Sometimes the Torah generalizes, and then the Torah is specific, and then the Torah generalizes again. We then generalize like the klal, but it has to be compared, the general rule has to be comparable in some way to the prat. So let's see an example. When it comes to the law of ma'aser sheni, of tithing, where you bring the produce up to Jerusalem and consume the tithe there, the Torah says, V'natata ha'kesef b'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha. The Torah says, you shall use the money to purchase anything you so desire. Now, what the Torah is essentially telling you is that when you have produce that you've tithed, 10% of your produce every first, second, fourth, and fifth year of the Shemitah cycle is subject to the tithe called Ma'aser Sheni tithe. You have to take 10% of your produce and either put it on a big wagon and drive up to Jerusalem, or if it's too unwieldy, too difficult to transport your produce, you do what's called pidyon. You transfer the value of your produce onto coinage, and you take the coins up to Yerushalayim and purchase goods in Yerushalayim that you consume in Yerushalayim. That's the law of Ma'aser Sheni. That's the biblical law of Ma'aser Sheni. The Torah really spells that out for us in Parshat Re'eh. The Torah says, what are you supposed to spend? What kind of goods are you supposed to spend the money on when you get to Jerusalem? It says, B'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha. Anything your heart desires. Then the Torah says, Babakar uvatzon uvayayin uvashechar. The next phrase in the pasuk is, you can spend it on cattle, you can spend it on sheep, you can spend it on wine, you can spend it on beer. That's the specific clause, because the Torah is spelling out for you what you can spend. But then the Torah says, the last phrase is, Uvechol asher ta'aveh nafshecha. And anything your soul desires. Now, of course, if I was speaking and I was using very legal, specific language, I would say, and I was writing a legal document, I would say, there's a lot of extraneous language here. Right? Because the Torah started off by saying, purchase whatever your soul desires. You can buy sheep, you can buy cattle, and anything else you want. Well, that's all superfluous. Just say, buy whatever you want. So the Torah is communicating something to us. So our sages have a tradition that the Torah is communicating to us something very specific based on the structure of the pasuk. First, the Torah starts with a klal of B'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha. Then the Torah specifies Babakar, Uvatzon, Uvayayin, Uvashechar, and then the Torah finishes with the klal of B'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha. We learn from this klal uprat uklal to include more than just the prat, which means I can buy more than just those 4 items. I'm not limited to buying sheep, cattle, wine, and beer. I can buy tomatoes also when I'm in Yerushalayim. I can buy apples if I'm in Yerushalayim. But what is it? In what respect does it have to be similar to the prat, to these 4 items? But it has to be similar to the prat. In this case, we would include all ba'alei chayim and gidulei karka. What do those words mean? Either they have to be consumable goods in the form of animals or produce. So, can I purchase salt with ma'aser sheni money? No. Can I purchase electronics with ma'aser sheni money? No. Can I buy a raffle ticket? No. It has to be something that I ingest and that I eat for nutritive purposes, but it also has to grow from the ground, or it has to be a living creature. So that's why the pasuk is structured in this way. That's what hermeneutics are all about, making a drasha from the pasuk. And this is virtually every single page of Talmud which teaches us law, tells us the method of derivation. So those are just some of the examples. And we say this braita every single day. Remember, we learned what a braita is? It's a text that is not part of the formal Mishnah, but was extant in the times of the Mishnah nonetheless. This is from a braita from the Sifra, which is a midrashic text which is around in the times of the Mishnah, and it's actually in the Siddur. It's the precursor to the Psuke de Zimra that we say every morning. It's Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Okay, just for reference, it's on page 48 in the Art Scroll Siddur, if you just ever want to look it up. And you'll see in the Art Scroll footnotes, it goes through a bunch of series of examples as well, just to give you an idea. Okay, it gets even more technical as it goes along, but we're not going to look into all of them. We'll just do the last one, number 13. Shnei ksuvim amachishim zeh et zeh, ad sheyavo hakasuv hashlishi v'yachriya b'neihem, bottom of page 3. 2 texts which apparently contradict each other. You will need a 3rd text to be the final arbiter of which text you follow. So here's an example. The pasuk in Shemos Chafhei, Perek Chafhei, tells us that Hashem spoke to Moshe from the kapores, that the voice emanated from the ark cover. And yet in Vayikra Perek Aleph, the Torah says that Hashem spoke to Moshe from the Ohel Moed, which implies that the voice emanated from the structure of the Mishkan, not specifically from the ark cover. These 2 psukim seem to be a contradiction. Chazal bring a 3rd pasuk, our sages bring a 3rd pasuk in Bamidbar, Perek Yud Zayin, that says that Moshe Rabbeinu stood in the Ohel Moed and heard Hashem speaking from the kaporet, from the ark cover. So the 3rd pasuk explains the other 2 to resolve the contradiction. Okay? That's the hermeneutics. Now let's go to the second part of our presentation tonight. Yes, yes, please.
Do the yeshiva boys learn these?
At some point, they're expected to know them.
Because when they learn the Gemara, it's already there for them.
It's already there for them. So this is an interesting question because you're asking a pedagogical question, which is how is the data presented to a yeshiva student? And the answer is that there are different yeshivot which have different pedagogical methodologies. Some of them wish to present and lay out for the student all the things that, the structure and what they're going to encounter. And here today, boys, you're starting your Haschalas Gemara in grade 6. And we're going to present to you the 13 principles by which the Torah is hermeneutically derived, how we make a drasha from a pasuk. A Rebbe may decide to teach that way. There may be a preference not to teach it that way. And for the Rebbe to say, this is one of the ways that we derive law from the Torah. And when you go through Gemara, you'll learn all of the other ways as we go along. I'm not sure which one is better for a 6th grader. I'm actually not sure whether... Well, anyway, there's a lot I'm not sure about. I think that there are more advanced methods of pedagogy that could be applied to teaching Gemara that are in use in some yeshivot, and there are other yeshivot that are more traditional and don't employ more of the modern pedagogical methods. I'm not sure, I don't know what's best because I'm not a pedagogical expert. Yes?
I didn't quite understand. What's the purpose of Maser Sheni? What does it accomplish?
Well, it's a tithe. It's, if you want to know, what did God have in mind when He told us to do this?
They use it for themselves.
Yes. Well, God says, I want to see you in Yerushalayim. Spend some money in Yerushalayim. Spend some time in Yerushalayim. So that way, we'll be close. Spend some time. It's like when you're a tourist, where's the place where you don't feel guilty spending a lot of money? In Israel or in Yerushalayim. It's because it's going to good use, right? So that's what Hashem is saying. Listen, you could use all of your assets and stay home with them, but I want you to come to Yerushalayim and use your assets there. Spend time living your life and enjoying your life with your assets in Yerushalayim. Okay, so that's, if you ask me what's the purpose, that would be the purpose. I found this also on the website chinuch.org, and I was very intrigued by the way that the author, this Rabbi Stern, presents the information. He calls this his Gemara roadmap. And this is what we're going to see for the rest of the evening, and then next week we're actually going to dive into a piece of Gemara. So we're going to spend the last 2 weeks learning Gemara. Next week we're going to learn a piece of halachic Gemara, which is really going to require, and I'll provide you with a bit of a syllabus to help you get through the text. And we'll divide you up with chavrutas, and we'll see how you do. But this is sort of like what I'd like you to take a look at, is that the Gemara is not a codified text. What I mean by codified is, like, this is the big difference between a text like the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemara. The Shulchan Aruch was invented during the medieval period to make life easier for a student. And what it essentially does is, it says, Chapter 1, Halacha 1, the laws of waking up in the morning. This is what you're supposed to do when you wake up in the morning. Chapter 1, Halacha 2, Chapter 1, Halacha 3, so forth and so on. Chapter 2, washing your hands in the morning. Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, laws of tzitzit. Chapter 6, Chapter 7, Chapter 8, 9, 10, laws of tefillin, right, etc., etc. The Gemara is not structured that way. And there's a benefit to not being structured that way. We certainly know the benefit of when you want to know what am I supposed to do. If you have a codified text, which means that it's structured with chapters and subchapters and sub-subchapters, you know exactly where to go for the information. The Talmud is not structured in a codified format. It is structured in a dialogue format, which means every page of the Gemara is Rabbi so-and-so turned to Rabbi so-and-so and asked them a question. And the other rabbi responded and said, why would you think that? And the other rabbi says, well, I'm bothered by this. The other rabbi says, you shouldn't be bothered by that. That's easily answered. And the other rabbi said, aha, but what about this? And the other rabbi says, that's not a problem. And the other rabbi says, but yes it is, because Rabbi so-and-so said the other day that is a problem. So they go back and forth until the matter is exhausted or the conversation ends. And it is up to the later rabbis in the post-Talmudic period to extract the final derivation of the law and to codify it. Why is there so much disagreement in the post-Talmudic era? Because the Talmud is a series of dialogues and conversations. It does not always tell us what the final psak, what the final ruling is. That served us very well for many, many years, and that was remember we learned in the very first class 2 weeks ago that the nature of the oral tradition, even when it's written down, is to preserve to the best of our ability the sense of orality to the oral tradition. So even when we have to commit the oral tradition to writing, we want to preserve orality. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi had his way of doing it. And his way of doing it was to be as terse as possible and write very, very small sentences and small pieces of information. And the only way to really unpack that information is if you had a teacher who was teaching you the text of the Mishnah and would expand on it. 3 or 4 centuries later, Ravina and Ravashi say that's not working anymore. Too much of that oral unpacking is being forgotten. So we need to write a secondary text and append that to the Mishnah. And that's what we call Gemara. But they said, and part of their science was, we still want to preserve the orality of that expanded secondary text. And therefore, we're not going to lay it out for you, but we're going to record the conversations, so that even when you're studying Gemara, you're going to need the guidance of a teacher-student connection to be able to unpack even the expanded Gemara text. Later generations debated what the final ruling is. And that's why we have so many times the Rishonim, the medievalists, debate, okay, we've got this machlokas in the Gemara between Shmuel and Rav, or between Rava and Abaya, or between Rav Papa and Rav Chisda. What's the final ruling? The Rambam says this, the Rosh says this, the Tosfos commentary says this, Rashi says this. So what are we supposed to do? We open up the Shulchan Aruch, and then the Shulchan Aruch tells us what the final ruling is. But wait a minute. The Shulchan Aruch has 2 authors. It's written in the 16th century. It's written by the Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, and then it includes the glosses of Rav Moshe Isserlis, who adds any time that he disagrees with the final ruling of Rav Yosef Karo, he says, but we do it another way. So the Shulchan Aruch, inherently built into it, contains machlokas as well. And then you've got secondary commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, which will sometimes qualify the rulings of the Shulchan Aruch as well. So every generation, it seems, builds upon that oral tradition by fine-tuning, qualifying, introducing new case law, and that's how we preserve the orality. But let's take a look now at some of the key terms of this dialogue format that we find in the Gemara. And these are the key terms that I'd like you to be familiar with. The first one is the word my. Whenever you see that word, the Gemara is asking a simple question. What? What does this mean? Second line, the pink, is where the Gemara is introducing a new discussion. And sometimes it will introduce a new discussion by the word gufa. Gufa means, let's refer back to something we were discussing before. Amar Mar literally means the master taught. Also, let's go back to something that had been previously taught by one of our sages, one of our teachers, that we need to expand upon. And Itmar is also saying, you know what, we're starting a new conversation or a new discussion, something that was stated by one of our teachers. It was a saying of an Amora. Okay, remember the term Tana and Amora? Did we explain that already? Just in case we haven't, we did it the first week, but just in case to make sure you understand. A rabbi of the Mishnaic period is called a Tana. A rabbi of the Talmudic period is called an Amora. And the rules of the Talmud are that a Tana may disagree with a Tana, but an Amora may not disagree with a Tana unless he's got another Tana on his side. Okay, so examples of a Tana are Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Okay, names of Tanaim that you will find listed in the Mishnah. If there's a machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, it's fair game for an Amora, a rabbi of a later generation of the Talmudic era, to say, I side with Rabbi Meir. And the other Amora will say, I side with Rabbi Yossi. But if there's only one statement made in the Mishnah that is unanimous, it is not debated in the Mishnah, then an Amora cannot come along and say, I disagree with the Mishnah. What he can do is say, we don't paskin like that Mishnah because there's another text from a text that is outside of the Mishnah but was authored at the same time as the Mishnah, called a Braita, that tells us a different law. Now remember, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi redacted or put together the text of the Mishnah. He carefully selected what he decided was going to be Jewish law. So there are certain texts that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did not include in the Mishnah which disagree with his decision of what the law should be. So it's fair game for an Amora to say, with all due respect to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the Braita which he left out is really the way we should paskin, not the way that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi redacted in his Mishnah. So that will sometimes be a topic of discussion in the pink line. Let's go to the green line. This line, this vocabulary, will be the subject of when the Gemara is raising an inquiry. We want to know what will be the law in such and such a case. So sometimes the Gemara will use the term tashma. Come in here. Come and listen. You've heard that before, tashma, come and listen. If we're either trying to prove a point or we're trying to challenge a point that had been previously made, which seems to be contradicted, that's what tashma is coming to teach. Minalan is another type of inquiry. How do we know? What is the source of this law? Ba'amine. So-and-so asked another person the following question. Ba'umine, they asked a question of so-and-so. Or ibayalahu is, they asked them. Or a question was raised generically. Let's go to the blue line. This is what's called a kushya, which means that it's meant to directly challenge a statement that was just made. So the Gemara makes a statement of law, and you'll find one of these 5 words will sometimes challenge that statement. Parich, which is he raised an objection based on logic. Matkif is another way of expressing that same idea of raising an objection based on logic. Masiv, or esve, or meseve, are all 3 ways of saying, I'm challenging you based on a source that seems to, from the Mishnaic period, that seems to contradict what you've just said. And based on the fact that you may not contradict a Mishnah or a Tana, your statement is problematic. We go now to the green line. Teirutz. The Gemara will sometimes preface an answer. What did I say? Sorry. Orange line. The Teirutz. Teirutz is what language the Gemara uses to preface an answer. So sometimes the Gemara will offer multiple answers. And the way the Gemara prefaces multiple answers to the same question is, I bayasema, if you want, I'll say this. Ve'i bayasema, and if you want, I'll say this. Ve'i bayasema, I'll say this. So the term I bayit ema means if you want, I shall say. That's literally what it means in Aramaic. Another way the Gemara prefaces an answer is by the words lo tzricha. This is only necessary for the following. In other words, even though what you've raised seems to be problematic, you misunderstood the statement of so-and-so, and lo tzricha, no, what he really meant to say was this. And the same thing is true with hachika amar. Hachika amar means this is what he said, or this is what he meant to say. Or hacha b'mai askinan. What are we dealing with over here? We're dealing with a specific case. And sometimes the Gemara will simply say, lo kasha. It's not a problem. Why is it not a problem? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Right? It'll tell you the words. Sometimes after the Gemara provides an answer to a question, it will augment the answer, supplement the answer by bringing a support to that answer. And these are the words that you'll find as preface to that supplementary argument, which what we call a raya, a proof. Dika nami, which means it may also be inferred from the following. Tanya nami hachi is that we have a mishnayik or braita text which supports that assertion. And sometimes the Gemara will be uncertain whether we have a text of support, and it'll say, Lema misayele. Let us suggest that this is a support. Sometimes the Gemara will accept that suggestion, and sometimes the Gemara will reject that suggestion of support. And finally, the purple line is stira, when there's an apparent contradiction between what was said and what is well known as being a direct contradiction to that statement. The Gemara will say rameh, he raised a contrast, or uraminhu, they raised the contradiction. It's very similar to the blue line, but the difference is that the blue line refers to a challenge that is made to an Amora's statement, and the purple line on the bottom is presenting a challenge usually between two Mishnaic texts that seem to contradict each other. That's usually how the terms are used. So this is helpful because as we take our model piece of Gemara next week, which will be from Bava Metzia, we'll see that a lot of these words will be used to introduce the next line of back and forth. Yes?
You were saying how the Gemara is defined on how we find different laws. So let's say you're looking for something specific in one of the Gemaras. How do you find the specific topic? How would you search it? So if you needed to know an answer to something, like if there's no table of contents?
There is no table of contents in the Gemara.
Right.
The chapters are ordered according to subject, but you might find something having to do with the laws of Shabbos in Masechet Chulin. You might find something having to do with ritual slaughter in Masechet Shabbat. A lot of times there are many tangents that, because the conversations grow organically. And so what you would typically do is open up a Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch in one of its commentaries has a margin note that tells you where this discussion is found in the Talmud. So that's one way of doing it. And overall, that's why it's very difficult for many people to sort of catalog in their own mind what where the Talmud talks about this, where the Talmud talks about this, which is why the best way to do that is to study a lot of Talmud and store a lot of it in memory. And that way you're able to pull it out. For feeble-minded people like myself, we have the new technologies that help us pull out information. So if I wanted to figure out where does the Gemara talk about the laws of Muktzah, I might do a search on my CD, my Bar Ilan CD, which is now by a USB stick, on Muktzah, and I'll get 1,000 different entries, or Nolad, which is a special case of Muktzah, and I'll get all of the references to that idea on my screen. So that's one way of doing it if you want to cheat. Some people are questioning the use of these tools because if you really want to become a scholar, if you sort of take the shortcut, it may stunt your growth. But at this stage in my life, I'm not going to use that argument. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Just to complicate it further, does like one discussion like stop in one part of the Gemara and the same topic and the same discussion continue? Like given that like someone brings up the discussion in one context, but then it could be like 10 masachats later they bring it up again. Like
many times that
is it
happens
all over the
that
place, the
you'll
same
have,
topic?
yes, sometimes I just gave a shiur last night just as an illustration. We were talking about the laws of davening with a minyan, and that appears, the natural place for that to appear is in Masechet Brachot, which talks all about the laws of prayer, as the word brachot implies. However, there is a parallel discussion in Maseches Psachim, in the tractate having to do with the laws of the Paschal offering and the laws of Passover. What's the connection? The Gemara there is talking about how everyone each sharing in the one Paschal lamb has to be in the same room. And the Gemara says, and by the way, the same law applies to when you're davening in a minyan, all 10 men have to be in the same room. So you have almost an identical conversation with slight differences in Masechet Brachot and in Masechet Psachim. The same discussion appears again in Masechet Eruvin, which talks about the law of an Eruv, creating partitions that can create an enclosure that would allow you to carry. And the Gemara there is talking about what if you're inside a doorway, are you considered inside or outside? And the Gemara says that same issue pertains to whether you have 10 men in a room and one guy is in the doorway, is he part of the minyan or is he not part of the minyan? So you see how organic this develops, that you can have the same discussion in 3 different places in Shas because they're all interconnected halachically in some way. You see that? Okay. All right, so we'll see. We'll actually dive into a piece of Gemara, and you'll learn your Gemara next week. Take care. Have a good night, everyone.